4 human beings are currently falling toward Earth at 25,000 miles per hour. Inside a capsule called Integrity, the world has turned into a wall of white-hot fire. Outside the windows, the atmosphere is glowing at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, heat intense enough to liquefy solid steel. The 4 astronauts inside can't talk to mission control, they can't steer away, and the only thing protecting them from being vaporized in seconds is a heat shield NASA already knew was broken. So why would NASA fly it anyway? Not broken in theory, broken in practice. Behind the professional smiles and the go for launch polls, the agency was taking a massive gamble. They were betting that a last-minute change in flight math would stop the shield from disintegrating. On the evening of April 10, 2026, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen were about to find out if the name of their ship was a promise or a cruel irony. To understand why these 4 people were currently in the most dangerous situation any astronaut has faced in decades, we have to look back 3.5 years. We have to look at a ghost ship called Artemis I. Before we dive into how that mission nearly derailed the future of space exploration, if you enjoy deep space stories and the high-stakes engineering behind them, make sure to subscribe. This mission pushed the limits of human courage in ways most people never realized, and we cover these stories every week. The story of the Artemis program is the story of humanity's return to the deep frontier, but it is also a story of how we handle the lessons of the past. In December 2022, NASA launched the first Orion spacecraft on a test run around the Moon. This was a monumental event, the first time a human-rated spacecraft had visited lunar space since the end of the Apollo era in 1972. No crew was aboard, just sensors and mannequins designed to record the vibrations and radiation of deep space. From the outside, the mission looked perfect. Orion circled the Moon, captured iconic high-definition photos of the Earth rising over the lunar limb, and came screaming home exactly as flight controllers intended. But when recovery teams fished the capsule out of the water off the coast of Baja California and flipped it over, the celebration stopped. The heat shield looked like it had been hit by a shotgun blast. To truly appreciate the shock the engineers felt, you have to understand what a heat shield is supposed to look like after it does its job. It was a 16-foot disc of a material called Avcoat, a complex composite of epoxy resin and silica fibers housed in a fiberglass honeycomb. It is an ablative shield. This means it is designed to hold onto the heat of reentry by charring and then melting away, slowly and predictably, layer by layer, much like a candle. This process carries the energy away from the spacecraft, keeping the interior cabin at a comfortable temperature even while the exterior is as hot as a small star. But Orion's shield hadn't melted evenly. It had fractured. Massive chunks of the material had literally detonated off the surface. There were over 100 locations where the shield had simply failed, leaving jagged scars and deep pits across the heat management system. NASA's own Office of Inspector General described the scene as a literal trail of debris following the spacecraft through the sky. If there had been a crew inside, they likely would have survived. This time, the internal structure held, and the life support systems didn't fail. But in the high-stakes world of aerospace engineering, the word technically carries the weight of a death sentence. The shield had protected the vehicle, but it had done so while showing signs of a catastrophic structural mystery. It had survived, but it hadn't worked. For the next 2 years, the Artemis program was effectively ground to a halt while NASA ran an exhaustive forensic investigation. This wasn't just a minor meeting, it was a nationwide effort. They performed over 100 physical tests at facilities across the United States. They used massive arc jets at the Ames Research Center in California to simulate the exact thermal environment of reentry. They used hypersonic wind tunnels to study the aerodynamics of the shedding fragments. They even used high-powered lasers to test the material's structural integrity under thermal stress. Engineers pulled roughly 200 samples of Avcoat from the recovered Artemis I shield and sent them to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama for chemical and forensic analysis. They were searching for a ghost in the machine. By December 2024, they finally published their findings, and the answer revealed a startling truth about modern manufacturing. They found that the culprit was a tiny change in the material's recipe. The updated version of Avcoat wasn't permeable enough. Think of it like this. When the heat shield burns during reentry, the material undergoes a chemical transformation called pyrolysis, essentially combustion without oxygen. This process generates massive amounts of gas deep inside the honeycomb structure of the shield. On a healthy, porous shield, that gas slowly seeps out through tiny, microscopic pores in the material and dissipates safely into the hypersonic slipstream. But on the Artemis Orion shield, the outer char layer had sealed itself too tightly. The gas had nowhere to go. It was trapped like steam inside a boiler with no relief valve. Pressure built up under the surface until it reached a breaking point, and then the shield literally started popping apart. These pressurized gases became microscopic bombs, popping chunks of the protective char layer off the ship like blisters on sunburned skin. The tragedy and the irony is that Apollo engineers had encountered and solved this exact problem more than 50 years ago. The original Avcoat formula used on the moon missions was designed specifically with this breathing capability in mind. It allowed the gases to vent so the structural integrity of the shield remained intact. However, the modern Artemis version of Avcoat had been reformulated slightly for modern safety standards and easier manufacturing processes. Nobody caught that this minor change had destroyed the material's ability to breathe until pieces of the shield were floating in the Pacific Ocean. This discovery created a crisis with no clean solution. NASA immediately ordered a redesigned, more porous heat shield for future missions, but the Artemis II hardware was already a different story. By the time the flaw was fully understood, the Artemis II heat shield was already finished, tested, and bolted onto the spacecraft. Replacing it wasn't a matter of just swapping a part. It would have required a massive disassembly of the spacecraft. It meant a 3-year delay for a program that was already 5 years late and billions of dollars over its original budget. Even worse, the Artemis II shield was actually denser and even less permeable than the one that had just failed on Artemis I. NASA had made it that way on purpose, thinking that a denser material would better test the bond between the shield and the titanium hull. They had accidentally made the popping problem even more likely to happen. Faced with the choice between a multi-year delay or a massive risk, NASA leaders made a decision that many outside the agency called reckless. They decided to fly it as is. The survival of the crew was now based entirely on a radical change in flight math. NASA engineers argued that the damage on Artemis I was caused specifically by its skip re-entry profile. This is a fuel-efficient technique where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces back up into space like a stone skipping off a lake to shed speed, and then plunges back in for the final landing. During that brief bounce or coast phase, the outer char layer had time to cool down and seal shut. Then, when the ship hit the air again for the second time, the trapped gas exploded. NASA's desperate solution for Artemis II was to use a loft trajectory. This would be one straight, brutal, uninterrupted plunge. They would come in steeper. They would come in much hotter. The plan was to stay in the fire so long that the shield would never get a chance to cool down and seal. They were going to fight the fire by making the fire even more intense. It was a counterintuitive gamble. To save the heat shield, they were going to subject it to the most punishing heat profile possible. But not everyone was convinced by this solution. Former astronaut Charles Camarda, a heat shield expert who was part of the first shuttle crew to fly after the 2003 Columbia disaster, publicly and loudly broke ranks with the agency. He was a man who knew the cost of guessing when it came to thermal protection systems. Camarda estimated the probability of a catastrophic failure at 1 in 20. That is a 95% chance of success, which sounds reassuring to a layman, until you realize that NASA's own internal safety threshold for crew loss is supposed to be 1 in 500. Camarda warned that the decision to fly was being driven by schedule pressure and political necessity rather than engineering certainty. He compared NASA's analytical tools to the same institutional failures that led to the Challenger and Columbia tragedies. This is what engineers call the normalization of deviance, the dangerous habit of seeing a flaw that hasn't caused an accident yet and deciding that it's no longer a flaw. The ghost that hung over every meeting was the Columbia disaster. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia had disintegrated over Texas, killing all 7 astronauts on board. The cause was superheated air penetrating a breach in the wing during re-entry. That breach had been caused by a piece of foam insulation, only the size of a suitcase, that struck the wing during launch. Engineers at NASA had flagged the foam strike while the shuttle was still in orbit, but management declined to investigate, reasoning that foam strikes had occurred on dozens of previous flights without consequences. They believed that because the system had technically worked before, it would work again. 23 years later, NASA was asking the crew of Artemis II to trust a heat shield that had already shown visible, measurable signs of total failure. The parallels were so uncomfortable that Camarda invoked the name of Columbia specifically as a warning. He argued that the agency hadn't fully modeled how cracks might propagate under the new, steeper re-entry path. He was essentially telling the world that NASA was about to launch a mission on a wing and a prayer. NASA pushed back against the critics. Their engineers ran worst-case computer simulations where entire blocks of the Avcoat material were stripped away mid-flight, and they concluded that Orion's underlying titanium-reinforced structure was strong enough to survive even that nightmare scenario. An independent review team examined the thousands of pages of data and eventually agreed with NASA's conclusions. The crew themselves had to make the ultimate decision. Commander Reed Wiseman, a veteran astronaut and former chief of the astronaut office, told the press that he had sat in the engineering meetings, walked through every line of the math himself, and was satisfied with the risk. He famously said, "If we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned, then this heat shield will be safe to fly." On April 1, 2026, at 6:35 in the evening, the Space Launch System rocket ignited on Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center. It was a historic moment, the first time in 53 years that humans had left low Earth orbit. For the next several days, the mission was a flawless triumph of human endeavor. The crew, Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen, pushed further into the void than any humans had ever traveled, reaching a distance of 252,760 miles from their home planet. They surpassed the record held by the Apollo 13 crew by over 4,000 miles. They saw a solar eclipse from the far side of the moon, a black disk surrounded by an ethereal ring of fire. They named a small, distant lunar crater Carol in honor of Wiseman's late wife, a gesture that reminded the world that these people weren't just icons. They were fathers and mothers with everything to lose. But as they began their journey back toward the blue marble of Earth, the beauty of the mission faded into the high-stakes reality of the descent. None of the records or the photographs mattered if they couldn't get through the fire. On the evening of April 10th, the crew separated their module from the European-built service module. From that moment on, Orion was on its own. Everything now depended on physics and geometry. The angle of attack had to be within a tiny fraction of a degree. Too steep, and the G-forces would be high enough to cause internal bleeding or blackouts. Too shallow, and the ship would skip off the atmosphere like a rock off a frozen pond, sailing back into the void with no fuel left to return. At 400,000 feet, Orion crossed what is called the entry interface, traveling at 24,661 miles per hour. The atmosphere, which we usually think of as thin and soft, began to hit the capsule with the force of a concrete wall. The air molecules piling up against the shield couldn't move out of the way fast enough. They compressed, and in the physics of hypersonic flight, compression means heat. The capsule vanished inside a glowing sheath of ionized gas. Through the small, thick windows, the crew watched their world turn from the black of space to a blinding orange furnace. For the 6 minutes of the re-entry blackout, the state of the heat shield was a total mystery to everyone on the ground. The plasma surrounding the capsule wasn't just hot. It was electrically charged, creating a literal wall of static that blocked every radio frequency. At Mission Control in Houston, the silence was absolute. Flight Director Jeff Radigan and his team sat in front of their consoles, staring at empty data fields on their monitors. They knew that their colleagues were currently inside a burning vessel with a known defect. Nearly 4 times their body weight pressed the astronauts into their custom-molded seats. Breathing became a conscious, difficult struggle. You have to fight just to squeeze air into your lungs as the force of gravity tries to flatten your chest like a massive lead weight. Your vision narrows under that kind of pressure. Your arms feel like they weigh 40 pounds each. The capsule shakes with a violence that feels like it will tear the ship apart, rattling with a deafening roar that sounds like 1,000 jet engines. Through the windows, you see nothing but the orange and white fire of 5,000 degrees. There are no stars, no sky, no horizon, just the furnace. There is no escape system during re-entry. There is no abort button. There is no backup heat shield tucked away in a compartment. NASA builds redundancy into almost every system they fly. Redundant computers, redundant thrusters, redundant batteries. But you only get one heat shield. It either works or it doesn't. And for those 6 long minutes, nobody on Earth knew if those 4 people were still alive. The clock on the wall hit 7:58 p.m. 6 minutes had passed since the radio went dead. Suddenly, the static broke. A voice, clear and steady, filled the room in Houston. Houston, integrity. We have you loud and clear. It was Reed Wiseman. The shield had held. The gamble of the loft trajectory had worked. The continuous heating had kept the Avcoat permeable, the gases had vented safely, and the char layer had eroded predictably, just as it was designed to do half a century ago. The material hadn't cracked, it hadn't fractured, and it hadn't blown chunks of itself into the hypersonic wind. At 22,000 feet, the drogue parachutes deployed, ripping the speed of the capsule down from 500 miles per hour to roughly 300. At 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes, each the size of a professional football field, blossomed over the Pacific. Orion hit the water in a perfect bullseye splashdown off the coast of San Diego. Recovery teams in inflatable boats approached the capsule within minutes. One by one, the 4 astronauts climbed out of the hatch, having traveled nearly 700,000 miles to the moon and through a wall of fire to get back. Wiseman was the last to exit the ship. They had survived the most dangerous gamble in modern spaceflight. The agency will analyze that heat shield for years to come. They will tear it apart bit by bit to see exactly how much margin was left and how close it truly came to the edge of failure. Engineers will likely debate forever whether the mission succeeded because of the brilliance of the new loft flight path or because on that particular night they simply got lucky. But for 4 people falling through the fire that night, luck was enough. They reached the moon. They touched the fire. And against the odds, the name on the side of the ship meant exactly what it said. Integrity had been earned through a crucible of plasma and pressure. Somewhere on the moon, a small bright crater called Carroll remains as a silent monument to the journey they took. And back on Earth, the 4 human beings who named it were finally home.